Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we journey back in time, not to a battlefield or a king's court, but to a place meant to be a sanctuary of silence and devotion, a place where the world was shut out, and the soul was meant to commune with God. We are traveling to the heart of the Middle Ages, to a stone convent somewhere in France. Picture it in your mind's eye. High walls of cold gray stone, a cloistered garden where herbs grow in neat, orderly rows, and long echoing corridors where the only sounds are the soft rustle of woolen habits, the murmur of prayer, and the distant tolling of a chapel bell. This was a world defined by order, by ritual, by a rhythm of life dictated not by the sun, but by the liturgy of the hours matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline, as darkness enveloped the world once more. It was a life of profound and demanding discipline, built upon the three pillars of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Above all, it was a life of quiet contemplation. Silence was not merely the absence of noise. It was a sacred vessel, a spiritual tool meant to empty the mind of worldly distractions and fill it with the presence of the divine. Into this fortress of silence, this bastion of holy order, a sound crept in. A sound that had no place there. It was not the chant of a psalm or the whisper of a confession. It was a sound that was earthy, common, and utterly bizarre. It began with a single nun. We don't know her name. We don't know her age. She is a ghost in the historical record, a patient zero in one of the strangest epidemics ever recorded. One day, for reasons no one could fathom, she simply began to meow. Like a cat. It might have started as a quiet, almost involuntary mewl, a strange tick that broke the solemnity of the refectory or the chapel. Perhaps the other sisters exchanged confused, scandalized glances. Perhaps the abbess delivered a stern reprimand. But it did not stop. And then the unthinkable happened. It began to spread. Another nun started meowing in sympathy, then a third, and a fourth. Soon, what had been an individual eccentricity became a collective compulsion. The bizarre behavior cascaded through the community like a fever, a contagion of sound that infected every last sister within the convent walls. The sacred silence was shattered, replaced by a chorus of feline cries. This wasn't a brief, fleeting moment of madness. It became part of their routine. The historical accounts state that for a certain period every single day, the nuns would gather together, and in unison they would meow for several hours. This is the strange and unsettling case of the meowing nuns. It sounds like a piece of surrealist fiction, a forgotten Monty Python sketch. But it is a documented event from our past, a chilling chapter in medieval history that forces us to confront the deep and often terrifying mysteries of the human mind. Tonight we will open this bizarre cold case. We will step inside the walls of that troubled convent and try to understand how and why an entire community of devout women came to abandon their prayers and instead cry out in the voice of a cat. Was it a prank that spiraled out of control? A shared delusion? A case of demonic possession? Or was it something else, a desperate, unconscious scream from a part of the psyche that had been repressed for far too long? Join me as we investigate one of history's most baffling psychological phenomena, a story that reveals the astonishing fragility of the human mind when placed under unbearable pressure. This is the story of the meowing nuns and the terrifying power of mass hysteria. To truly understand the bizarre events that unfolded within that French convent, we cannot simply look at the what. We must deeply and thoroughly examine the where, the when, and the who. The phenomenon of the meowing nuns is not merely an anecdote. It is a product of its environment, a symptom of a world so vastly different from our own that its pressures and fears can seem almost alien. So, before we diagnose the illness, we must first understand the patient, the medieval nun. Let's begin by dismantling the romantic image of the convent as a peaceful, voluntary retreat for spiritually minded women. While it certainly was that for some, for many others it was something else entirely. In the rigid, patriarchal society of medieval history, A woman's life path was narrowly defined. She was a daughter, then a wife, then a mother, her value intrinsically tied to her marriage, her dowry, and her ability to produce heirs. But what of the women who didn't fit this model? The convent became the answer. For the nobility and the burgeoning merchant classes, it was a practical and often necessary social institution. A nobleman might have several daughters, but only enough dowry to marry off one or two advantageously. The remaining daughters, the surplus ones, were often placed in a convent. It was a respectable alternative, one that maintained the family's honor and didn't drain its resources. These girls, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, were given to the church as oblates. They did not choose this life. It was chosen for them. They grew up within the stone walls, their entire existence circumscribed by a vow they never personally made. The convent also became a repository for women deemed difficult or inconvenient. A widow who was too powerful or too attractive, posing a threat to her late husband's heirs, might be encouraged to take the veil. A young woman who was too rebellious, too intelligent, or who resisted an arranged marriage might find herself escorted to the convent gates. It was, in many ways, an elegant and socially acceptable prison for women who deviated from the norm. So, within the walls of any given convent, you would have a volatile mix of individuals. There were the truly devout, women who sought a deep and genuine connection with God. But alongside them were the unwilling, the resentful, the abandoned, and the grieving. They were all bound together by the same strict rules, sharing the same cramped quarters, wearing the same habit, but their inner worlds could be universes apart. This was a recipe for immense, unspoken psychological tension. Now let us consider the life they were forced to lead. It was a life of radical deprivation, designed to purify the soul by mortifying the flesh. The vow of poverty meant they owned nothing, not even the clothes on their backs. Everything was held in common. The vow of chastity meant the complete renunciation of sexual desire and human intimacy, desires that do not simply vanish when a vow is taken. And the vow of obedience meant the surrender of all personal will and agency. A nun's life was not her own. It belonged to her abbess, her order, and her God. Her every action, from the moment she woke to the moment she slept, was dictated by the rule of the convent. The routine was relentless and monotonous. The day was structured around the 8 services of the divine office, beginning with prayers in the cold, dark chapel long before sunrise. Between these services were periods of manual labor tending the gardens, spinning wool, copying manuscripts, and silent, contemplative meals in the refectory. Personal conversation was often forbidden, with some orders enforcing strict vows of silence for most of the day. Imagine a life without privacy, without personal choice, without loving touch, without the freedom to even speak your mind. It was a pressure cooker of repressed emotion. Grief, anger, frustration, longing, resentment, all these feelings had no legitimate outlet. They had to be suppressed, prayed away, or silently endured. The psyche, however, is not a bottomless pit. When emotions are consistently repressed, they do not disappear. They fester. They seek other, stranger, avenues of expression. Into this already fraught environment, we must add the pervasive and terrifying spiritual landscape of the medieval mind. We live in a largely secular scientific age. When we feel unwell, we think of viruses, bacteria, or chemical imbalances. The medieval person lived in an enchanted world, a world where the veil between the physical and the spiritual was gossamer thin. Their universe was an active battlefield between the forces of God and the forces of Satan, and the human soul was the contested territory. Demonic possession was not a metaphor. It was a terrifyingly real and present danger. The devil and his legions of demons were believed to be constantly at work, seeking to tempt, corrupt, and destroy human souls. They could cause illness, incite lust, whisper blasphemies into your ear during prayer, and in the most extreme cases, take direct control of your body. Any strange or aberrant behavior, from a sudden illness to a fit of blasphemy, could be interpreted as a sign of demonic influence. For the women in a convent, this fear was magnified 1,000 times. As the brides of Christ, they were considered to be on the front lines of this spiritual war. Satan, it was believed, took a particular and malicious delight in corrupting the most devout. The convent, meant to be a fortress against sin, was seen as a prime target for demonic assault. Every nun lived with the constant, gnawing anxiety that a moment of weakness, a flicker of doubt, or an impure thought could open the door for a demonic entity to enter. Their own bodies and minds were not safe spaces. Now let us introduce the final crucial element into this explosive mixture: the cat. In the 21st century, we see cats primarily as beloved pets. In the Middle Ages, the cat held a deeply ambivalent and often sinister reputation. On the one hand, they were useful, tolerated for their ability to control mice and rats in granaries and monasteries. But on the other hand, they were profoundly associated with the powers of darkness. Cats were seen as creatures of the night, their glowing eyes and silent, stealthy movements unsettlingly uncanny. They were linked to pagan traditions and folk magic. Most damningly, they became inextricably linked with witchcraft and the devil. The black cat in particular was often believed to be a demon in disguise, a witch's familiar, or even the devil himself. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous 15th century witch-hunting manual, explicitly discusses how witches could transform into cats. To harm a cat could be to harm a witch, but to see a cat could be to see an agent of Satan. This symbolism is absolutely critical. When that first nun began to meow, she wasn't just making a silly animal noise. In the context of her time and place, she was doing something profoundly transgressive. She was giving voice to a creature associated with heresy, sexuality, and demonic power. She was, in a symbolic sense, channeling the very forces the convent was built to keep out. It was a shocking and terrifying act, a crack in the sacred wall of order. So the stage is now set. We have a closed, isolated community of women, many of whom are there against their will. They are living under conditions of extreme psychological stress and sensory deprivation. They have no acceptable way to express powerful emotions like anger or grief. They live in a constant state of spiritual anxiety, terrified of demonic influence. And into this environment, a single, potent, and deeply disturbing symbol is introduced: the cry of a cat. Now we can return to the narrative. The first meow was the spark, but the kindling was already bone dry. The sound, so bizarre and out of place, would have been a massive jolt to the system. The other nuns, already living on a knife's edge of anxiety, would have been highly suggestible. When the second nun joined in, it was a moment of critical mass. The behavior was validated. It was no longer a personal madness, but a shared experience. The contagion spread rapidly. Why? Because it offered something that their rigidly controlled lives did not: a release. The act of meowing, of abandoning human speech for animalistic cries, was a profound, albeit unconscious, act of rebellion. It was a rebellion against the vow of silence, against the crushing monotony of the daily routine, against the demand for constant piety and composure. In that shared chorus of meows, they could express everything they were forbidden to feel. Chaos instead of order, wildness instead of restraint, perhaps even a defiant solidarity in their shared misery. The accounts say they would meow in unison for several hours each day. This detail is significant. It suggests the behavior became ritualized. It wasn't random. It became a new perverse part of their daily office. Perhaps it happened at a specific time, like a dark parody of Vespers. They would gather, and the pressure that had built up inside them would be released in this bizarre, collective catharsis. To an outsider, it was madness. To the nuns themselves, caught in the grip of this psychological phenomena, it may have felt like the only sane response to an insane situation. The chaos within the convent walls could not be contained forever. The sound of dozens of women meowing like a colony of feral cats for hours on end was not subtle. The noise would have carried over the walls, disturbing the surrounding neighborhood. People in the nearby town would have heard the strange cacophony emanating from the house of God. Imagine their confusion, then their fear. In the medieval mindset, there could be only one explanation. The convent was bewitched. The holy sisters had fallen prey to the devil. Panic and rumor would have spread through the town. The convent, once a symbol of piety, would have become a place of dread. Eventually, the local authorities had to be called in. The situation had become a public nuisance and a spiritual scandal. The chronicles describing the event, like those by the 17th-century writer Nathaniel Wanley, who compiled tales of this nature, describe the intervention. A company of soldiers was dispatched to the convent. Their methods were not those of a modern therapist. They did not sit the nuns down for counseling. They did not try to understand the root causes of their distress. They employed the standard medieval solution for disruptive and inexplicable behavior: the threat of physical violence. The soldiers entered the convent, likely armed with whips or rods. They announced to the assembled, meowing nuns that if they did not cease their caterwauling immediately, they would be flogged. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Now that the strange fever has broken, our investigation can move from documenting the event to attempting to explain it. The people of the time would have had their own clear and terrifying conclusion. The soldiers may have stopped the meowing, but they had only treated the symptom, not the disease. In their view, the convent had been the target of a full-scale demonic assault. The first nun was seen as the beachhead, the weak link in the spiritual chain through whom Satan had gained entry. The meowing was the devil's voice, mocking God from within his own sanctuary. The contagion was the demonic influence spreading from soul to soul, a spiritual plague. The intervention of the soldiers was seen as a form of exorcism by intimidation. The demons, being creatures of pride, could not bear the humiliation and pain of a physical flogging, and so they retreated. The nuns were cured, but they would remain spiritually scarred, forever marked by their terrible ordeal. This explanation for them was not a theory. It was a self-evident fact, perfectly consistent with their understanding of the cosmos. But for us, looking back through the lens of modern psychology and sociology, a different and perhaps even more fascinating explanation presents itself. The case of the meowing nuns is now seen as one of the most vivid and well-documented examples of a phenomenon known as mass hysteria, or, in more modern clinical terms, mass psychogenic illness, MPI. So what is mass hysteria? It is the rapid, spontaneous spread of physical or emotional symptoms through a cohesive social group, for which there is no identifiable physical or organic cause. It is, in essence, a collective stress response, a psychological contagion that spreads through a population just as a virus would. And the convent of the meowing nuns was the perfect petri dish for its cultivation. Let's break down the classic ingredients for an outbreak of mass hysteria and see how perfectly they matched the conditions in the convent. First, you need a closed and isolated group. The nuns were literally walled off from the rest of the world. They lived in close proximity, interacting only with each other. In such an environment, emotional states and behaviors can spread incredibly quickly, without the diluting influence of the outside world. They formed a closed feedback loop. Second, you need the presence of long-term, inescapable stress. As we've explored in detail, the life of a medieval nun, especially an unwilling one, was a life of chronic, high-level stress. The emotional and psychological repression was immense. Their bodies and minds were in a constant state of high alert, with no healthy outlet for the pressure. Third, you often need a trigger event. This was the first nun's meow. This initial bizarre act broke the dam of social convention and provided a model for a new, previously unthinkable behavior. It acted as the index case that kicked off the epidemic. Fourth, the symptoms often have a symbolic meaning within the group's shared cultural framework. As we discussed, the act of meowing was not random. It was laden with powerful symbolism related to sin, chaos, and the demonic. It was a culturally resonant way of expressing the very things they were supposed to suppress. The behavior, while unconscious, was not meaningless. It was a form of symbolic communication, a cry for help in a language their culture understood, the language of spiritual affliction. Fifth, the contagion spreads through suggestion and social conformity. In a highly anxious and suggestible state, seeing a peer exhibit a strange symptom can be enough to trigger it in yourself. There is a powerful unconscious pressure to conform to the group's behavior, even if that behavior is bizarre. Each new case validates the reality of the phenomenon, making it more likely to spread further. Finally, the phenomenon often ends abruptly when the group's attention is diverted, or when an authority figure intervenes decisively. The arrival of the soldiers and their threat of flogging provided a massive pattern interrupt. It introduced a new, more immediate and more terrifying stressor. The fear of a demon you can't see was suddenly replaced by the fear of a soldier with a whip you can see very clearly. This shock to the system was enough to break the trance-like state of the group and bring the collective behavior to a halt. Seen through this lens, the story of the Meowing nuns transforms from a supernatural horror story into a tragic human drama. It's the story of a group of women trapped and powerless, whose minds collectively broke under the strain. Their meowing was not a sign of demonic possession, but a desperate, unconscious protest. It was the only way their repressed selves could scream. It was a mass panic attack, expressed in the symbolic language available to them. This is the core of mass hysteria. The body and the group psyche expressing what the conscious mind and the social rules will not allow to be said. And the case of the Meowing nuns is not an isolated incident. Medieval history is filled with similar outbreaks of bizarre, contagious behavior, often originating in convents, which were the epicenters of psychological pressure. In Germany, there was a famous case of the biting nuns, where one nun began to bite her companions, and the behavior spread through her own convent and then, incredibly, to other convents across the country. In the 15th century, a nun in the Netherlands fell into a state of agitation and began to meow like a cat, a clear echo of our French case. These were not just confined to convents either. The most famous case of mass hysteria is undoubtedly the dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg, where a woman began to dance uncontrollably in the street. Within a month, hundreds of people had joined her, dancing for days on end without rest, many of them collapsing and dying from exhaustion and heart attacks. In all these cases, the pattern is the same. A population under extreme stress from famine, disease, or psychological repression finds a bizarre, physical outlet that then spreads like wildfire. These were not plagues of the body, but plagues of the mind, powerful testaments to the strange and sometimes terrifying connection between our inner worlds and our collective behavior. The story of the Meowing nuns endures, centuries after the last echo of their cries faded from those stone corridors, because it speaks to a fundamental and unsettling truth about the human condition. It reminds us that the line between order and chaos, between sanity and madness, can be terrifyingly thin, both for individuals and for entire societies. The convent was designed to be a microcosm of divine order, a perfect, self-contained world of piety and peace. But in its pursuit of absolute control, it created the very conditions that allowed for a total breakdown of that order. The legacy of this strange event is its value as a stark case study in the power of psychological phenomena. It demonstrates that our minds are not isolated fortresses. We are porous social creatures, profoundly influenced by the emotions and behaviors of those around us. It shows how a shared belief system, whether it's a terror of demons or a modern-day anxiety, can shape and spread a collective response. And most poignantly, it is a story about the cost of repression. It reveals the strange, unpredictable, and often self-destructive ways the human psyche will fight for expression when it is silenced, caged, and denied its fundamental needs. The meowing was the symptom of a sickness, not of the soul, but of the suffocating circumstances in which these women were forced to live. This bizarre footnote from medieval history serves as a timeless cautionary tale. It challenges us to look at our own world and ask where such pressures exist today. Where do we see closed groups under intense stress? How do shared anxieties, fanned by social media or 24-hour news cycles, manifest in our collective behavior? The phenomenon of mass hysteria did not die out in the Middle Ages. It simply changes its form, adapting to the fears and symbols of the current era. The underlying mechanism remains the same. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most peculiar episodes. The tale of the Meowing nuns is a potent reminder that the strangest stories are often the most human, revealing the hidden pressures and unspoken truths that lie just beneath the surface of our carefully constructed societies. If you found this exploration of mass hysteria and the mysteries of the medieval mind compelling, I would be most grateful if you would show your support. You can do so by leaving a like on this video, subscribing to Bedtime History for more journeys into the past, and ringing the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And now I have a question for you. Having heard the story and the competing explanations, what is your conclusion? Do you believe the modern psychological explanation of mass hysteria fully accounts for the events? Or do you think there are elements of the story that remain unexplained? And can you think of any modern phenomena that seem to share the same characteristics as these historical outbreaks? Please share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. I always find the collective wisdom and unique perspectives of this community to be one of the most rewarding parts of this process. Until we meet again, sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful and decidedly free of any unexplained meowing.